Test one, there we go. As I said earlier, I do want to greet those of you who are joining us online this evening as we gather together for a study of God's Word. We'll begin, as we normally do on Sunday evenings, with a review of the morning's message. As the author of Acts, Luke, works his way through the early history of the church, he has a series of progress reports. These are little asides that Luke does for Theophilus, to whom this letter was written, this history was written. And this morning we arrived at the fifth such progress report, Acts chapter 16, verse 5. And so this morning, what we did is we did what we normally do when we reach these progress reports. We first look at the progress report, make sure we understand what it's saying, and then after that, I use the progress report as an opportunity to review what has happened in the book of Acts from the previous progress report to this one. And so that's what we did this morning. We began with a look at this particular progress report. There were 2 points that the Apostle Luke makes, here in this text. He looks at first the spiritual stability of those to whom the ministry was taking place, and then the numerical growth. Now, the context of this particular progress report is important because in verse 4, you'll notice, of Acts chapter 16, that Luke highlights the fact that the missionaries were sharing the decrees given by the apostles and the elders of Jerusalem, the mother church. Now, you remember, of course, in Acts chapter 15, that a controversy sprung up regarding Gentiles and their inclusion in the church. And so the decrees were the final decision that the Church of Jerusalem made regarding the issue that was raised regarding Gentiles and circumcision. And so Paul and Silas, who are now moving out into this missionary journey, are sharing the decrees with the Gentile churches. And Luke here in verse 5 gives us the response of the Gentile churches to the decrees. The first response, again, is their spiritual stability. Here, Luke indicates that they were strengthened in their faith. We looked at this word strengthened, and it was used back in Acts 3 to describe the healing of the lame man. His feet were made, his ankles and legs were made firm. So the idea here is firm. I traced the various words from this family of terms. We looked at how the verb was used, how the adjective was used, how the noun was used in reference to this particular word from this family of terms. And so we're pretty confident that the meaning here is to firm. It doesn't necessarily mean that their faith was weak, but really this is a reference back to chapter 15, verse 24, where we learned that they were, in fact, unsettled. They were disturbed by what the people had told them at the beginning of Acts 15, that you had to be circumcised to be saved. That unsettled the faith, disturbed the faith of the Gentile believers. So the decrees encouraged them, strengthened them, firmed them up. And so we looked at that. We then looked at the numerical growth, those churches that were strengthened, the believers who were strengthened. God was adding to their number on a daily basis. And so we talked a little bit about church growth, the importance of it. We're obviously not against church growth, but we also wanted to indicate that sometimes church growth can be had at any cost, and we don't believe in that. And so that was the looking at the progress report itself. We then reviewed what we had learned from the previous progress report. The last progress report number 4, was Acts chapter 12, verse 24 and 25. There we learned that Paul and Barnabas had come back to Antioch from the trip to Jerusalem, and also that the church was being encouraged and was growing. And so the next section, division, the fourth division of the book of Acts began in chapter 13. And so we reviewed what we had learned from chapter 13 through the first part of chapter 16. The first division of this new section was Paul's first missionary journey. That was chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 28. We looked at the call to missions, their outreach to Cyprus, to Poseidon, Antioch, to Iconium, to Lystra and Derbe, and then the conclusion of the trip. We also looked at the Jerusalem Council and Gentile salvation. That was chapter 15, verses 1 through 35. We looked at the controversy that had grown up. We looked at the meeting of the council, their delineation, their decision, response, and then the conclusion. And then the third part of this fourth division of Acts looked at Paul's second missionary journey started, which we started last week. Here we saw the separation of Paul and Barnabas from each other, and then the formation of Paul's mission team, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. And so that was the review. It was just to kind of get us caught up with where we were and to reintroduce some material to us as we planned to move forward in our understanding of the book of Acts. Any questions on the morning's message? Yes?
In my Bible, it might be my translation, but it says they were strengthened in the faith, which it's not really that different. You kept saying in their faith, like you were making it more personalized, and so I was just wondering, did that mean anything?
Well, there is some discussion. What were they strengthened in? The reason that I focused on the personal side of it is because it was more than just they were strengthened in Christianity. They were strengthened in their faith because they were unsettled. And so that's kind of why I emphasized that. Yeah.
But it wasn't anything from a translation standpoint?
No, not really.
What does the NIV say?
The churches were being strengthened in the faith.
In the faith, okay.
And then they have a note next to it which says also in faith.
Okay.
Either one of those.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so,
I can't hear you, no. As soon as we get the mic on, we'll be able to. There we go.
okay, yeah, regarding Saul or Paul and Barnabas,
Yes.
when the Holy Ghost separated them out, a lot of people feel that at that point both Saul, Paul, and Barnabas were designated apostles, and I would know your thoughts on that, or Barnabas and Paul.
Yeah. This is kind of an issue in the church, who the apostles were, because as we work our way through the book of Acts, we sometimes see a broader application or broader designation, if you will, of who we would identify as an apostle. So how should we understand this language? Well, what I have tried to do is I've tried to distinguish in the New Testament two different types of apostles. So we have the apostles. And based on Acts chapter 1, I'm confident in saying that there was a group of individuals called the apostles of Jesus Christ. This group was limited and was temporary. These individuals, like Peter, James, John, individuals like the Apostle Paul, Paul recognized the fact that he was this is his own language, untimely born, meaning that he was outside the scope of these individuals. These individuals are people who were with Jesus from his baptism to his resurrection. And so it's a very limited group. Again, Paul is part of this group, but Paul would recognize himself as being unusual. Apostles of Jesus Christ. There's another group. In fact, I preached a sermon. The first time we bumped into this as a church was when I did a series of messages from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul uses the language of apostle to refer to an unidentified individual. From that text and other ones throughout the book of Acts, there seems to be a second group that I call apostles of the church. Again, the word apostle simply meant sent one. So these apostles are neither limited nor temporary. They had nothing to do with seeing Jesus from the baptism to his resurrection. And so if an individual that wants to identify, for example, Barnabas as an apostle or James as an apostle, that's often argued that James, the brother of Jesus, was an apostle, I list those under this category, because this word is used for individuals that don't fit this description. Apostle, a sent one. They're sent not of Jesus Christ, but they're sent of the church. And so that's how I would differentiate those two groups. But I don't necessarily have a problem with people using the language of apostle broader than the apostle of Jesus Christ, as long as they realized that this first group was limited and was temporary. Yeah. That's a good question.
So you don't think that should be used today?
I don't have a problem with apostle being used today. Now, you've heard me preach on this. The reason I struggle with that is because people don't use this language properly. And so they call themselves an apostle, and either they're deceived and think they're in group one, or they're deceiving and making other people believe they're in group one. And so I would shy away from that language just because it's not understood very well. Yeah. An apostle, and so I'm not opposed out of the language if it's used properly. Any other questions on the morning's message?
Do you know of a group that uses it properly?
Do I know a group that uses apostle properly?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of a group, and there are a few groups that do use the designation. More often than not, you see it used amongst like renegade. I shouldn't say renegade people, but Kojic uses it, and just other independent churches where the person labels themselves an apostle. They use it too in that way. But I do think that we need to be cautious in our use of this particular language, and not get caught up with, because oftentimes when people call themselves an apostle, the reason that they're doing that is to elevate themselves over a regular minister. It's the same reason why some ministers call themselves bishops. And so some people use the language because they're over a number of churches, but that's still an unnecessary designation. Oftentimes they use it to differentiate themselves from a regular pastor. But this language, whether it's calling yourself an apostle or a bishop, we need to be careful with that, and because it's so misused in our culture today, and we particularly in Christian circles, it's just not used very well, and so I would kind of shy away from it, but I'm coming up short of saying it shouldn't be used. I don't want to say that because the Bible uses it, so I don't want to misstate something, but I do think we should be cautious in our use of apostle. Any other questions on the morning's message? Yes.
You mentioned a church that does not have elders is incomplete.
Incomplete, yes.
And I don't know if we need to maybe tweak that a little bit.
Okay.
Because I came from a church that had elders. And we know about that church.
Yeah. Just because you have elders doesn't make you a good church.
Right.
Yeah.
I could say that churches that have biblical elders are complete.
Yeah, and so what I was trying to get at this morning was I was trying to speak to the issue of, is it okay for a good church not to have elders? And I would encourage every good church to have elders because elders are biblically normative. Now, having elders doesn't mean that your church is right. And that's your point, and it's a valid point. It's a valid point that's well taken. I wasn't trying to communicate that if you have elders, you're good to go. Because you are right, there are many churches that have elders but are renegade churches. They're not biblical churches. And so for that reason, just because they have elders doesn't mean that bypasses all of their error. But I was speaking mostly to good, sound churches, many of whom don't believe in eldership or practice it. And so I do believe churches that fail to practice eldership are not fully meeting the biblical requirements of a church. And so a church should have elders, which is why, again, it's interesting to me that, and I didn't labor on this point when I got to this text, and I probably should have labored a little bit more on this point. But I don't know if it struck anybody else as odd, but given our present climate of eldership. But Paul planted the church, finished the missions trip, and on the way back installed elders. That doesn't surprise anybody? I mean, nowadays people think you can't be an elder unless you've been to 10 years of seminary. In some churches, I'm not saying that we have a low standard of eldership, but what are we trying to accomplish in eldership? I mean, on the way back, he appointed elders. And so we're shooting for mature people in the congregation, people who have demonstrated the characteristics that Paul highlights here in the text of Scripture, are clearly gifted by God with the gift of teaching. Those individuals can serve as elders. We should, because some people say, well, we haven't been around that long to have elders. Well, these churches weren't around that long. That's striking to me. Again, I didn't labor on that very long, but it's something that we have to really think through of how our understanding of eldership, and is it really biblical, or have we imposed upon Scripture an idea of eldership that this Bible itself doesn't know? Yeah. All right. Any other? Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. If you could for a moment look at Galatians chapter 2, verses 7 to 9. Let me see. I'm going to switch over to try and switch to the NASB 95.
Okay.
Just for convenience. Okay. Basically it says, but on the contrary, seeing that I have been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcision, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles, and recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Mm-hmm. So do you feel that gives any more weight to Barnabas being in the same position as Paul?
No, not really. Again, I would have no problem saying that Barnabas and James were elders. Obviously, elders of the mother church, Jerusalem. When we get to Acts chapter 15, we see that Paul and Barnabas are sent not just to the apostles, they're sent to the apostles and the elders. I don't think you have to be an apostle to have authority in the church. And clearly, clearly James and Barnabas had authority. I don't think you have to make them an apostle for them to have that authority. It's pretty clear from Acts chapter 1 that you had to have seen both the baptism and the resurrection and everything in between to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's pretty clear. It's also clear that when we get to a Revelation, that the apostles are pictured as being 12. So I don't see the need to open up the apostle of Jesus Christ designation to people beyond those chosen by Jesus Christ, and Paul, who again identifies himself as one untimely born. Technically, Paul is saying, I should not have been an apostle. Well, why shouldn't Paul have been an apostle? He didn't see the baptism through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So technically, to call him an apostle is a misnomer, but Christ came down specifically and designated him. So you can't beat that. And so you have no such special designation on Barnabas's point. You don't have, at least we don't have it in the Bible, where you have a designation through vision by Jesus Christ that identifies him as an apostle. And so I would shy away from calling him an apostle of Jesus Christ. I have no problem calling him an apostle of the church. That would not be a problem. With authority, yeah, he definitely had authority. Yeah. Yes.
In Revelation, you talk about the 12 apostles.
Yes.
Then is Paul one of the 12, or is that? I mean, you know.
I would say he's not one of the 12. Okay. And there's some debate as to, did the church, was Paul meant to be the 12th apostle, and the church overstepped its bounds when they instituted an individual in Judas's place in Acts chapter 1. I think it's hard to make an authoritative statement from that. Again, Paul recognizes the fact that he was untimely born. Unless God would have come down and told them not to do that, there was no way for them to know.
Yeah.
And so they operated in good faith and appointed somebody who fit the prescriptions.
The previous.
Yeah, who fit the prescriptions from his baptism to his resurrection. And so I don't think that Paul would be considered one of the 12 in that sense. And Paul didn't consider himself one of the 12. In the text this morning, well, one of the texts this morning, you remember I went through Paul's sermon in Antioch, and there he identified the witnesses, and by his language, he clearly does not mean himself.
Right.
Okay, he's identifying the 12 independent of himself, and so Paul, I think, is recognizing that there is a designated position that those men have that he's not a part of that, but he is an apostle nonetheless of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles specifically. Yeah. Yes.
Verse in 2 Corinthians 8 that talks about apostle of the church.
The language, I'd have to look at the Greek text. It's been a while since I've been in there in the Greek, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 8,
Oh, first?
sorry, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'd have to get back with you on that.
Okay.
Any other questions on the morning's message? All right, well, excellent questions this evening. Let's continue in our Bible study.